Right now, Donald Trump's biggest obstacle isn't the Democrats, the media, or even the deep state. Those forces are all out in the open, and he sees them and you see them. His biggest problem today, and going into 2026, is an ideology which has been festering inside the Republican Party for decades, and it goes back to the time of the American Revolution. It's a blind faith in the free market economics of the British East India Company and the Bank of England. I know for years you've heard groups like the Heritage Foundation or the Tea Party or the Koch family funded Americans for Prosperity and a whole bunch of congressmen and Republican candidates tell you that the key to prosperity is cutting taxes, cutting the budget, and getting the government out of the way so that the magic of the market can, well, do its magic. But what if I told you that this magic is black magic? And it's not only fundamentally anti American, but it will actively sabotage Trump's ability to fulfill his promise to make America great again. Now, you all know that yesterday, President Trump waded into the fight over his big, beautiful bill, going up to Capitol Hill and telling congressional Republicans, don't F around with Medicaid. Why? Does any serious person, including President Trump, think that having tens of millions of Americans reliant on Medicaid is a good idea? Or that there isn't plenty of fraud and abuse in Medicaid? No. But what President Trump and his team understand, and a big chunk of Republican congressmen don't, is that obsessing with cutting the budget is a dead end at best and will lose the 2026 elections at worst. Yes, cut the fraud and abuse, but begin to wield the federal government as a tool to build our way out of our economic decrepitude. President Trump is doing that with tariffs and the big, beautiful bill, which is a reconciliation bill containing important tax and spending provisions. This is one piece of an entire strategy which completely rejects the economic dogmas of the past 50 years and the globalist system which they serve. I'm Susan Kokinda, and I've been politically active for all of those 50 plus years, intervening at every level from the White House and Congress to the grassroots here in Michigan, where I was recently elected as Coalition's vice chair for the Michigan GOP. This is your midweek update coming from the front lines of a key battleground state where the fight is on to create a new Republican Party that can actually fulfill Donald Trump's vision. For most of the past 100 years, the economic debate has whipsawed between two versions of British liberal economics. But Donald Trump gave us a chance to get out of that box. The 2024 election saw over 70 million Americans reject the Democratic version of economic liberalism, which consisted of Federal Reserve money printing, anti-growth green policies, and the strategy of compensating the loser by throwing government programs at the tens of millions left by the side of the road. But Trump gave us an alternative to the Republican side of British neoliberalism. And the poster child for that school of thinking includes John Locke, Adam Smith, Friedrich von Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Ayn Rand. The mantra of those free market fundamentalists is simple. Government is the problem and the market is always right. Open up to the world markets and let the invisible hand guide us to prosperity. Well, if you looked more closely, you would see that the invisible hand was just another name for the financialization of everything on behalf of a global imperial elite. And if you listened carefully, you would have heard the giant sucking sound that Ross Perot warned about in his 1992 presidential campaign, which led to the deindustrialization and the disappearance of the kind of jobs where one income could support a family. So here's the truth that the free market crowd doesn't want you to consider. America's problem isn't that we spend too much, it's that we produce too little. The real measure of a nation's strength isn't its GDP or its stock market. That's why President Trump says he's the president of workers, not Wall Street. Our real wealth is our physical productive output, our factories, our infrastructure, our skilled workforce. This used to be called the American system. Listen carefully to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, and for that matter, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Bessent and Vance are openly embracing the father of the American system, Alexander Hamilton. And Trump understands this. That's why he's focused on bringing back manufacturing jobs, rebuilding our infrastructure, and unleashing American energy. If you study the executive orders he's issued, you will see some amazing things. Besides the obvious tariff policies, which has drawn the full support of the UAW, did you know that he has tasked his secretaries of labor, commerce, and education with fostering the creation of 1 million skilled trade jobs? These policies drive a return to the American system of fostering productive activity. And by becoming a member of Promethean Action, you'll be joining a movement that has been fighting this fight for decades. So please go to our website and join and learn. Donald Trump also understands that an American foreign policy is one based on treating other nations as sovereign entities with their own legitimate cultures and interests. And that, as he recently said, we have no permanent enemies. But too many in his own party just don't get it and continue to fall for the traps set by the global financier elite, which is why so many genuine MAGA members of Congress are having so much trouble wrapping their heads around Trump is doing with the big, beautiful bill, or why he supported raising the debt ceiling, or why they are having just as much trouble understanding or supporting some of his foreign policy initiatives with countries like Russia or Syria or Iran, or alternatively, why he is icing out Bibi Netanyahu. So let's look at how Trump has shedded both strategic and economic orthodoxy this week. Start with the Russia-Ukraine negotiations. On Monday, Donald Trump had a 2-hour discussion with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That in itself sets the globalists' hair on fire, because one of their central tenets is to keep the United States at loggerheads with Russia and China, but that's another story. And that's why Trump 45 had to battle Russia, Russia, Russia for 4 solid years. But even today, besides the card-carrying neocons like Lindsey Graham and John Bolton, you have genuine Trumpers like Steve Bannon who still talk as if Russia or Iran are our permanent enemies. In his Truth about the Putin discussion, Trump made clear that the end of the war must be negotiated by Russia and Ukraine. Well, it is the beginning of the summer offensive, and Ukraine doesn't have any cards left to play, which Trump pretty much told Zelensky in their public confrontation in the Oval Office recently. Trump also praised the excellent tone and spirit of the discussion with Putin, and in a later press conference commented that Zelensky was difficult to deal with. Suggesting the possibility of the Vatican as the host of the negotiations is also very interesting. Trump has pretty much also kicked the British and the Europeans to the side in terms of negotiations. About the only thing they have left to do is to start World War III. And speaking of World War III, Trump made another major announcement yesterday, along with Defense Secretary Hegseth, laying out the parameters of his Golden Dome defense program, which we will be analyzing and covering in much greater depth in the coming days. But yesterday's press conference pointed back to the original Strategic Defense Initiative, proposed by Ronald Reagan over 40 years ago. In his famous 1983 speech, Reagan directly addressed the danger of nuclear war, and he said the purpose of the SDI was to, quote, make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Reagan's SDI was sabotaged by the globalists and their Democrat and neocon allies for 2 reasons. First, they wanted to keep the thermonuclear chicken game going so they could play the superpowers off against each other. But the second reason involves some largely unknown history. I mentioned my earlier political activities. Well, that included being in the middle of the development of the SDI in Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s, when Lyndon LaRouche was in direct collaboration with the Reagan administration and was urging that Reagan adopt the SDI, not only for the important strategic reasons, but also as a massive science driver, using new physical principles to replicate the economic boom of the Kennedy Apollo project years. Well, let me tell you where the sabotage of Reagan's SDI came from. Yes, people like Henry Kissinger, the Bush interests, and the Democrats opposed it. But all sorts of conservatives, including the Heritage Foundation, completely undercut the new physical principles part of the SDI, proposing off-the-shelf technologies which were not sufficient to protect us from Soviet ICBMs, and which excluded the science driver economic component. And then there were the budget balancers, who strangled funding for the SDI, as well as for other advanced technologies like reprocessing nuclear fuel and for nuclear fusion research and development. Frankly, we should already have a fusion-based economy, and we would were it not for the fact that fusion funding was kept at the level of fusion never for decades. President Trump is beginning to reverse that, by the way. This brings me back to the problem of the no government intervention into the sanctity of the markets ideology. You have genuine patriots like Senator Rand Paul and Representative Tom Massey, both hardcore libertarians, who are fighting Trump's economic policies. But contrast Senator Paul's opposition to tariffs to the gut-wrenching picture of economic destruction caused by unfettered free trade presented by Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt in a piece he recently wrote. He said, they shipped the good-paying middle-class jobs that once were the backbone of our economy to places like Mexico and China, transforming once prosperous towns and cities into hollow shells of their former selves, often defined by addiction and death. All the while, in the forgotten corners of this land, the men and women who built this country have suffered in silence. They watch in quiet despair as their towns crumble into disrepair, their way of life disappears, and the country they love slips away from them. And then look at the members of the House Freedom Caucus, which includes some of the most staunch political defenders of Donald Trump, who are dragging their feet or are even opposed to him on aspects of the big, beautiful bill. What are the libertarians and those Freedom Caucus members and so many others missing? They're missing the very essence of economics. That is, the ability of mankind to exert greater dominion over nature through physical growth, driven by technological progress, driven by the creative powers of the human mind. Yes, the government should not get in the way of that, but it should also foster it. That is how we used to think, at least implicitly. And that has been under attack by British philosophical liberalism, which says that you act on the world through your senses and measure the results through the accumulation of money or stuff. Again, return to Missouri Senator Schmitt, who said, today we have been taken by the idea that our social status is not what we build or create, but what we can afford to buy or consume. The post-war order has given birth to a shallow morality of materialism that measures values strictly in terms of consumption. This is a poisonous new idea, utterly alien to the traditional American way of life. It is alien, but unfortunately it's not new. It's the ideology against which we fought the American Revolution. So if you want to support Donald Trump and you want to win in 2026 and keep the congressional majorities, which Donald Trump absolutely needs, stop listening to the free market fundamentalists. Stop worshiping at the altar of Adam Smith or Friedrich von Hayek. Learn the American system. Build the new Republican Party of workers and producers, which Donald Trump has called for. I bet a lot of this is new to you. Well, that's good, because the old way of thinking, politically and economically, is going to sink the Trump revolution. So please join the fight. We need your support, your membership, and your contributions to educate and mobilize the movement which will complete the Trump revolution. This has been your midweek update from the front lines in Michigan. Thanks for watching.
Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at PrometheanAction.com.